Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture where we take a look at a critique of rationalism. We're going to learn about Hume's fork, which is what you read about for today, and discuss the limits of being a rationalist. So once again, remember, taking a look, not licking a look, taking a look at how to justify knowledge. The skeptics say you can't justify knowledge. All you have are just beliefs. The empiricists say you can justify it. You justify it through sense experience. And the rationalists say you can justify it through reason, through logic. You can get knowledge prior to experience. From our last lecture, we noticed that there are several reasons to be a rationalist. One, the rationalists believe they resolve all the problems we saw with empiricism. The problem of perception, because you can come to conclusions, right, just by thinking alone. They deal with the problem of induction, because they can come to generalized knowledge statements, not having to experience all of something, but simply by thinking about it. Similarly, they believe they can resolve the problem of causation, right? They don't have to see cause and effect. It just makes sense when one event follows the other event over and over again. It makes sense that one must cause the other. They also say, look, our approach is the only one that can give you things you can know for sure. It's only our approach that can give you necessary truths. And as you mentioned a second ago, they believe it's through reason that you can expand your knowledge much more accurately, much more easily, right? Just by thinking about it. From a few basic premises, you can grow that without the problem of perception. Okay, so let's take a look at this last one first. Can rationalism really easily expand your knowledge? Take a look at this example from last lecture. All fruits have seeds, an apple is a fruit. The rationalist says, therefore, you know something new now. You know that, therefore, apples have seeds because it makes sense logically. Remember this example also from last lecture? The murderer was at the restaurant wearing size 10 shoes. Joe was the only person at the restaurant wearing size 10 shoes. So the rationalist says, you can expand your knowledge from here. You can know something else. What else can you know? You can deduce that Joe must have been the murderer. The rationalists will say, look, in that first example, which is labeled number 3, because it was labeled number 3 in the previous lecture, in that example, therefore an apple has seeds. You don't have to go use your sense data to look at all apples to know that. You can know that just from those first two premises using reason. But wait a minute, what's needed before you even get to the conclusion? Wait a minute, how did you know all fruits have seeds in the first place? How did you know that apple is a fruit? In order to know that fruits have seeds, don't you have to look inside fruits? Didn't you have to do some observation of fruits, experiments with fruits, tests of fruits? Didn't you have to use your sense experience to find out that fruits have seeds? So the empiricists will say, look, your expanding of knowledge doesn't just come from reason alone, it comes from empirical sensory perception, right? It comes from impressions. It comes from impressions from the outside world. Similarly, take a look at that next example, example 4. The rationalist says, look, you can know Joe is the murderer just by thinking about it, by reason alone, without sensory data, without sense experience. But wait, how did you know the murderer was at the restaurant wearing size 10 shoes? Wait, how did you know Joe is the only person at the restaurant wearing size 10 shoes? Didn't you have to know that through experience? Didn't somebody have to find a clue on the ground? Didn't some eyewitness have to look at a shoe of the murderer? And I mean, didn't that have to come from experience somehow? So while the rationalists claim that their conclusions come from reason alone, it's based, say the empiricists, on experience. Those premises you have to have seen somehow first. So to know anything about the world, it seems you need to first use empiricism before you use your sense of reason. But what about this example? What about this one? If we know that the triangle is 180 degrees, and you know angle A is 120, angle B is 34, I'm just using reason here to come up with the angle for angle C, right? I'm not digging up triangles. I'm not digging up, I'm not looking at different triangles to find out that the angles equal 180. We just know that. We just know that the angles for sum of the angles of a triangle equals 180 degrees. I'm not having to use empiricism there, right? Doesn't this get away from that criticism we saw in the previous slide? Well, think about this from the Hume reading I had you look at today. Hume will have you ask, okay, so you know that the third angle is, what's it, 26 degrees. What do you actually know? I mean, what are you saying you actually know there? Think about that. We're going to come back to that in a second. So a possible or final exam question could be the following. Explain Hume's theory of knowledge. In this case, you can shorten that to Hume's fork, which we'll talk about in a second. Explain Hume's theory of knowledge, or Hume's fork, as we learned it in class, and how it can be used to critique rationalism. Okay, so keep that triangled example in the back of your mind. Think about necessary truths for a second. The rationalists will say, we have truths that we can know for certain, truths that we know for sure, right? And we know that simply by thinking about it. Such as a bachelor is an unmarried male, such as a sister is a female sibling, such as 2 + 1 = 3, such as 2 is more than 1. See, we can know this for sure, for certain, just on reason alone. What do all of these have in common? What do all these different types of truths that you can know for sure have in common? How do you know a bachelor is an unmarried male? How do you know a sister is a female sibling? How do you know 2 + 1 = 3, or that 2 is more than 1? Don't you know that because we defined it to be true? Isn't a bachelor an unmarried male because that's how we define the word bachelor? Isn't a sister a female sibling because that's how we defined what a sister is? 2 + 1 = 3. I mean, where did that come from? Who came up with numbers? Didn't we? Aren't we the ones who came up with numbers? Didn't we define 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and plus, and equals, and all of that? Isn't that just from us? What's the obvious rub here? Well, Hume brings up the obvious rub here, right? And this is what's referred to oftentimes as Hume's fork. Hume identifies two different types of truths. On one hand, he says there are some truths that are just relations of ideas, right? Bachelor's unmarried male, a sister's a female sibling, 2 + 1 = 3. These, yeah, they have to be true because we define them to be true. They actually don't tell us anything about the world. So if we're truly trying to find knowledge, is that really knowledge? If 2 + 1 = 3, just because that's how we defined it to be, is that really knowing something of the world? Is that what we refer to as being knowledge? A bachelor's unmarried male, are we learning anything about the world? No, we're just reiterating something that human beings defined, right? The other type of knowledge, says Hume, is matters of fact. Here is knowledge of the world, and this knowledge of the world is gained through experience. The fact that you're sitting down staring at a computer, I mean, this is knowledge of fact. This is not something we just made up. No, this is something you're experiencing right now of the world. You know it to be true. Think back to that triangle example. It is an example of a rational argument where you come to know the third angle, right? The value of the third angle is 26 degrees simply by thinking about it. But how do we know a triangle has angles that add up to 180? I mean, we defined it that way. That's how we define what a triangle is. So are we actually learning anything about the world when we do that? Well, Hume says no. That's all just relations of ideas. Real knowledge is just really matters of fact. Real knowledge then comes from experience. And in this case, yes, it's not necessarily true. It is true contingent upon experience. How about this problem of induction that the rationalists believe they've solved? Well, the problem of induction actually was made famous by Hume, by an empiricist. That's odd. An empiricist presents a problem for empiricism? Yes. Hume is the one who notices this, right? Hume notices that we can't make general knowledge statements about the world. You can't say all apples go from trees based upon your experience, with all of these apples that you've seen grow on trees. It's true, you can't. But neither can the rationalists. The rationalists can't justify this either. Because remember what the rationalist response was. How can you justify knowing that all apples grow from trees based upon, your previous data that all the other apples you've experienced grow on trees? The rationalists say because it makes sense. It makes sense that all apples grow from trees based upon our experience that every single apple we've seen has grown from trees. It makes sense that when you do certain studies with certain chemicals and drugs and it shows certain tendency that this will be true of the population. It just makes sense. Well, Hume asks, why does it make sense? Why does it make sense? What's the rationale there that it makes sense? How do you know that based upon all these particular experiences with this chemical in the lab, that it'll have the same result on the next time? How do you know that when you try this drug with this mouse and this mouse and this mouse, and it seems to get rid of COVID, that the next mouse or the human being you try it on next, that it'll work for them? How actually do you know that? Rationalists? What do you mean it makes sense? Well, Hume is going to summarize the rationalist thought process here by saying the rationalists believe that the course of nature continues always uniformly the same, right? That what you've seen in the past in nature will be true continuously, that the future will be like the past. This is the assumption the rationalists are making, and it makes sense to them to make that assumption. But does it really make sense to believe the future will be like the past? Hume's famous example of this is with the rising sun. Imagine somebody asking you, will the sun come up tomorrow? You'll go, yeah, the sun will come up tomorrow. The person asks, why? And you go, because it's come up for me every day that I can remember, right? So this person is using induction. All the samples he's taken of all of these days in his past, and the sun has always come up. So based upon all of the days in his past where the sun has come up, based upon that trend, he's going to come to conclusion that tomorrow the sun will also come up. Basic science. But is that necessarily true? Can you really say that? What's the reason to believe that the future will be like the past? Isn't the only reason to believe the future will be like the past because the future has been like the past? Isn't that kind of a circular argument? How do you know tomorrow will be like the past? Because yesterday was like the past. Well, just because yesterday was like the past, why does that mean tomorrow will be like the past? That doesn't make any sense, right? With Hume's example here, the only thing we know is that the sun has always come up in the past. That's the only thing we know, is that the sun has always come up in the past. But why does that necessarily mean it has to come up tomorrow? What's the reason to believe that nature is uniform? Why does nature have to follow a pattern? Why does nature have to follow a trend? Just because it's been like that in the past, why does that logically mean that it has to be that in the future? This is a huge problem of induction. Hume's solution is to say, we can't. We can't really justify that tomorrow will be like today or tomorrow will be like, we can't. Logically, we can't. The best we can say is we believe it based upon habit, right? We believe tomorrow will be like the past because every past day we've believed tomorrow will be like the past. It's habit. It's custom for us to believe that. It's something we've always done. That's the reason to believe it. There is no other reason, right? If you are trending a pattern, like say you're graphing a pattern, you notice that everything is going up until today. So maybe you're doing like a stock chart, and you notice that since the stock came into existence, it's always rising. Does that mean it's going to continue rising tomorrow? What's the reason for that? Hume says there is no rational explanation for that. And in fact, it's a rational problem because for rationalists, they're using induction to support induction. It's referred to as begging the question. It's like if you have a book that you want to believe is true. Like here's a book with a bunch of facts, and you want to believe it's true, and you ask the person, well, "How do you know it's true?" And they tell you, "Because the book says it's true." What? Hume points out that's what's happening here with the rationalists when they believe induction. You ask the rationalists, well, how do you know that you can generalize the future based upon the past? Because of induction. They're using induction to prove induction. And hopefully you can see how this is connected to causation too, right? It's the same sort of idea here. When you say that some event always leads to another event, so that event caused it. So I used my Advil, and then my headache went away a few days ago. And then the next day I used my Advil, my headache went away. And then earlier today I took some Advil, my headache went away. So I guess taking Advil caused the headache to go away. As an empiricist, you can't say you saw the cause. And as a rationalist, what reason do you have for believing your Advil caused the headache to go away? I mean, the only thing you have is the experience that it's worked for you in the past. I mean, the only thing you have is just all these experiences where you saw that relationship. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be true tomorrow. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is a tie there that is for sure something that exists called causation. What Hume points out is, the mind naturally forms associations between experiences. You are driving your car and you turn your wheel and then the car turns. You're driving your car, you turn your wheel, and the car turns. Your mind naturally has, it's naturally going to form associations between those two experiences. And then it's natural for us to say, this caused that. Well, then, isn't that just also knowledge from habit? Isn't that just knowledge because you're accustomed to seeing those two events follow the other? Right? What rational argument can you make other than it's always been that way? What other rational argument can you make that causation exists other than I think I've seen causation all my life? But you're assuming causation exists to say you think you've seen it. Same sort of idea with induction. So Hume points out that both for induction and causation, even though the rationalists believe it's through reason that you can justify those things, notice induction requires you making experiments, which is empirical. Induction requires you to have past experience of something to generalize. Well, that experience is from empiricism, right? When you're making when you believe in causation, what you're saying is that you've experienced an event and then you've experienced another event, and that those two events are always following one another. Well, how do you come to the notion of causation? Well, it's because you've experienced those two events. It's through empiricism that you come to a belief in causation, not through rationalism. So, Hume's fork. Relations of ideas, a type of truth. Matters of fact, a type of truth. And as a result, Hume is going to say, yes, certainty does not exist in science. That's why science is about continually questioning your hypothesis and progressing, right? There is no certainty in science. 2, Induction and causation are just all grounded in habits based on experience. You only believe in causation not through reasoning it, but because you've seen events follow each other all the time. You've seen that the taking of the Advil gets rid of your headache. You've seen that stubbing your toe causes you to feel pain, right? You've experienced that over and over again. So it's habit that you believe in causation. It's habit that you generalize that what you've experienced in the past will occur in the future. And three, relations of ideas, they don't give us knowledge of the world. They just give us knowledge of our own ideas, which we as human beings made up. So what do you think? What do you think of Hume's approach to epistemology? Or what do you think of Hume's empiricism? Does it adequately deal with rationalism? Does it account for all the positives that we mentioned last class as to why be a rationalist and the type of knowledge you can gain from being a rationalist? Plato and Descartes don't necessarily think so. But what do you think? Which side are you on now? Are you more of a rationalist? Or are you more of an empiricist? Next class, we're going to take a crazy turn and see how this fight will maybe eventually stop and grind to a halt when we take a look at Kant's Copernican revolution and his Kantian compromise. And we'll do that in our next lecture.